Welcome, everyone, to the 35th Hands-on Agile meetup. Today with a very special guest, Daniel Stillman. Daniel is not just one of the really well-known design thinking practitioners, but he's also the host of one of my favorite podcasts, The Conversation Factory. It's all about this fluffy thing that we call communication between humans and all that is included, etc. pp. And I'm really excited that he said, yes, we're going to do an interactive session. And I'm so glad that you all can make it and that you are here. And without any further ado, Daniel, stage is yours.
All right. We'll start with the stuff right off the bat. The link to my podcast is there. You can find my personal site. Connect to me on LinkedIn. Come say hi. It's a thing. Stay in touch. Obviously, if you want to connect to each other, you should just put your own LinkedIn profile in and we can all just connect to everyone. That's totally a thing that we should do. Yeah. So like Stefan said, I have had this podcast for a couple of years. I have a background as an industrial designer and a physicist. I studied physics in my undergrad and I studied industrial design for my graduate degree. And then when I got out of school, I was like, wait a minute, there's this whole other thing that's happening. Nobody told me that industrial design had its heyday in the 50s. And there was this long, slow decline. And the thing that was really happening was interaction design. You may have noticed that like everything you hold is small and there's a screen on it. My company in 2007 realized that too. So I really started on this journey of like, well, wait, nobody taught me how to design conversations in design school. But as it turns out, that's all of the things that we do is getting people together to have conversations, to make decisions together. And everything you see in the world that is terrible and awful, like all the worst Super Bowl commercials, those are all a result of just terrible conversations where somebody said, no, sure, that seems like a good idea. Or like, I don't care. Right. So that's why I think the stakes are high on conversations. Conversations are how we coach people. It's how we consult with them. It's how we win work. It's how we make girlfriends and boyfriends. It's how we make friends and win, influence people. Like, you know, if you're a Dale Carnegie fan, I'm going to share a very, very tiny bit of non-slides. A lot of the ideas in here are from my book, How to Design Conversations That Matter. Good talk. You can definitely find free chapters of the book on the internet. And the big idea in the book is that we have a conversation OS. We all have our own operating system when it comes to designing conversations. And I tried to just boil everything down to 9 clear elements that were easiest to see, easiest to shift when it comes to creating the conditions for transformative conversations, which is what I would say leadership is. Leadership is the art of creating the conditions for a transformative conversation. And one of the main things we're going to be talking about today is the art of invitation, the questions that we use to initiate and continue powerful conversations. I propose that we're all conversation designers in the sense of the Herb Simon definition of design, which is to devise courses of actions aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones. Like we don't get to make things worse on purpose. Raise your hand if you're allowed to make things worse on purpose. We'll see if I can see as many. Oh, Paul's like, no, I am not allowed to do that. Arna's like, I am specifically paid to make things worse on purpose. Who here gets, can make things better on purpose by accident from time to time, right? But generally speaking, it's our job to make things better on purpose. That's what skill and art look like. That's what we're paid to do, is to design courses of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones. And we do that through conversation. I would say that the fundamental unit of change is a conversation. So we're going to play a couple of games on Mural. And the first thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to invite you to this section in just a moment. What I'm going to ask you to do is grab one of these colored dots. You can put your name, you can write your name on it if you'd like. And I would like you to add a dot to the area on this most powerful to least powerful scale. We have 4 questions here, and I'd like to investigate with you which of these questions do you think are more powerful than the others? What did you mean? How long has IT been unresponsive to your needs? What kind of changes do you want to make today? And how can I help you? So if you think one question is the most powerful, you can put a dot on the most powerful. Oh my God, there are so many people moving around right now. It's exciting. So let's take a look. What questions are the most powerful? Which questions are the least powerful? We're here to talk about powerful questions and how we can craft more powerful questions. What we are doing here is we are grabbing colored sticky notes. Putting your name on them is optional. And then I'd like you to vote for the most powerful and least powerful questions. See if you can, I don't know, you might want to stack rank them. All right, I'm very, very curious. It seems like we are fairly evenly distributed when it comes to the first question. There doesn't seem to be a general consensus whatsoever. But when it comes to the next 3 questions, there seems to be, yes, exactly. Somebody's circling and saying, there are some people who are saying, how long has IT been unresponsive to your needs is less powerful than what kinds of changes do you want to make today and how can I help you? I'm curious, somebody who voted high on what kind of changes do you want to make today and how can I help you? Anybody want to just drop in the chat what makes them feel like those questions are more powerful? Why are those questions more powerful, the second 2 questions more powerful than the first 2 questions? Okay, so some people are saying they're open-ended. People know best what their issues are. Ask them what they need rather than think you know best and for a short period of time. Volker, say more about that. That's interesting. Like they're time delimited somehow. Which questions do you see as time delimited?
This one heading for just today because I can oversee my day. I know my meetings, and so
Yes.
it's pretty concrete and not that abstract. How can I help you is more general on private, on my business, on whatever. So what can I do for today, because this gives really a short period of time to think about.
I think this is really interesting. And I'm actually, one of our exercises is going to be focusing on the time orientation of questions, because I think that is a super powerful source of juice in a question. And I'm really glad that we're talking about opening versus closing. Like Cheryl, I really appreciate that. How can I help you is very, very general. She's like, I didn't vote for that as the most powerful question. And indeed, like, I don't know, if we were to do like some sort of a regression analysis, maybe there's slightly more people who think that what kind of changes do you want to make today is slightly more powerful. So the question, as Ellie pointed out, these more powerful questions encourage people to think more differently. They invite more creative thought, as Deborah is saying. And this is a really interesting set of perspectives and an interesting set of heuristics to start to apply to the questions that we're going to be generating together. And this is the first thing that we're going to do. There's a section here where I'm asking you, what is your most powerful question? Each and every one of us, I know, is an effective professional, which means we navigate complexity all of the time. We navigate complex conversations all the time. And so I'm curious, there's about 200 sticky notes here. There's about 113 of us here right now. So everyone can take about 1 sticky note. You can also double click and make another sticky note for yourself. Let's take 2 minutes. And I would love for everyone to generate what they feel like is the question that's in their back pocket that really helps them invite more powerful conversations, deeper thought, more effective work. what's one of your favorite questions? And what we're going to do for the next hour is do a lot of exploration and synthesis of those questions. And we're going to try and make them more powerful. We're going to try and rethink them. And my hope is that at the end of this time that we have together, you are going to leave with not just a clearer perspective on your own more powerful question and how to make them more powerful, but absorb all of these powerful questions from everyone else in the room, leave with a huge and powerful library of amazing questions to bring into your work and more creative ways to apply them at different moments in your creative process. That's my plan. One of my favorite things to do with Mural is the little star icon on the right allows you to put in iconography. And my favorite icon to add to something is the fire icon. And if you happen to see a question that you think is fire, fire is slang for awesome, by the way. You can also pull in any other icon you want, but let's just take a second, look over the questions, add an icon of fire or other appropriate. Thumbs ups is kind of boring. We definitely have better iconography that's available to us. And maybe one of the questions you see sparks some more creativity and you go, oh my God, wait, my boss always used to ask a question like that, but I use it this way. So if you want to add one more and yes, and any of the questions that you're seeing, that'd be totally cool too. But let's take a second and add some iconographies. This can help us sort of spot which questions are the ones that we're noticing are more interesting, that have some potential. Now, I want to leave this list intact as we go into our next activities, which means we need to copy and paste these questions. I'd like to make sure that we don't erase any of these questions, that we keep them as a starting point of our conversation. And I love that there's a why and there's a why not. This is great. Anybody want to call out any question that they just have to say out loud that is just wowing them, is flooring them, is an amazing question that deserves to be said out loud? How can I support you? What a beautiful question. And different than what is important to you, or why is that important to you? So here's what we're going to do. I just ran a coaching workshop with my friend Elise Foster for our communities, where she used the question forming technique, which is developed by the Right Question Institute. I can share some links for that later. And what I thought was really interesting, Bartosz mentioned open versus closed. So what I'd like people to do, let's move all of these questions in area 2 down into area 3 by whether or not they are open versus closed. So we're not deleting any. Anybody want to define a closed question for me? Bartosz, I know that you talked about closed versus open questions. A closed question can be answered with yes or no, and an open question requires an explanation. Now, it's actually really interesting. I just read an article about dinner time. And this person basically was saying that asking somebody what time they have dinner is the most powerful icebreaker that they know of, because it's such a simple question that nobody actually says 7 o'clock. While you'd think it's a closed question, you're like, what time do you have dinner? 5 o'clock, 7, 8. What people actually do is they automatically tell you a story about it because it's such a simple question. And it really blew me away that this was a fascinating perspective, that sometimes, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more in a second, that sometimes closed questions can be really powerful. It's not to say that closed questions are more powerful than open questions. It seems like we're doing some good voting. And I love that some people are taking the dot votes along with them. That's really, really good thinking. Good job, everybody. By the way, I've totally put this board together for you, Stefan, and this group. It was totally improvisational. So some of these are experimental exercises. So I'm glad you're bearing with me. I want us to be able to explore this question. Now, it seems like a lot of our powerful questions are open questions, and fewer of them are closed questions, which is totally cool. But what I'd like us to do now is to take a try, and I'm going to put like 5 or so minutes on this timer, is to think about flipping a question from opened to closed, or flipping a question from closed to open. Now, in order to do this well, we need to be a little bit careful. Let's see if we can just model one of these. Let's take the first one up in this corner, and I'm going to paste it here in its similar location. Alexander, thank you for reminding me. What was your, it was a specific question.
I just wanted to give a shout out for one of the questions. Sorry, for one of the questions as a product person specifically. But it was something about when do you know we're successful as a product person, especially recently. I've been assessing with the teams I work with quite a lot about definition of done and definition of ready.
Yes.
So when is it done? When is it successful? Great question.
It is. And how will we know?
We never will. And another side topic on that, instead of, when is it done? Because sometimes that alludes to it needs to be perfect. I was listening to a podcast the other day about waste, and they were talking about when is it good enough? I think that's also equally powerful, especially from an agile perspective.
Oh, absolutely. What is enough? It's a very powerful question. So I see some people taking a shot at this. My goal, and this again, totally experimental doing it this particular way with this many people, copy and paste a question that you think is interesting and kind of try to paste it in a similar location in the flipping area. So we're moving things from, we're copying questions from area 3 to area 4. And I'd love for people to take a chance on flipping a question from opened to closed or from closed to open. And we're going to talk about that. So we're going to take this, we're just going to try to do some thinking on this for a couple of minutes. I'm wondering if people want to help me with flipping, what would you like to happen into a closed question? Because what would you like to happen is a fairly open question. How can we make it more closed? Drop some suggestions in the chat. Oh, Cheryl, that's great. Do you want A or B to happen? I'm very curious if anybody wants to share their experience. Well, I want us to talk a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages of close-ended questions. So let's talk about these two sets of questions here. These closed questions that some of us shifted to open questions. So we have some questions like, do you think this is doable? Did I ask you what you really wanted to discuss? How much? Could you tell me about this? Do you want to do this? Do you feel good about this? Would you please hand me over those infinity stones? That's an amazing question. By the way, if anybody watched last week's What If, you'll know that that was an amazing episode. I was deeply scintillated. No spoilers, obviously. Some of these questions, I would say, are very powerful. What are some of the advantages of closed questions? Anybody wants to drop that in the chat or come off mute and shout at the top of their lungs in defense of close-ended questions?
I can propose a distinction between them, or how they are differently useful.
Yes.
So open questions, they create options and they explore the unknown. So they are kind of divergent, create more threads for you to follow, more conversations.
Yes.
While the closed questions allow you to converge on the answer solution, finish the conversation in a way.
It's interesting because Mandeep, you actually propose a different perspective, that closed questions make it easier to start the conversation. Can you say a little bit more about that?
I'd like to piggyback on what he said then, until he speaks up, is that sometimes you need to break the ice.
Yes.
And it can be a good icebreaker sometimes just to get people to start talking. So a simple yes or no it can be a much easier response than starting the divergent type thinking.
I agree. And by the way, what would Jar Jar Binks do is definitely an open-ended question. Let's be really clear on that, just for the record. That's not a closed question. It's more closed than open, but it's not a fully closed question. I think there's something about giving people a frame to be in. This question here, from 1 to 10, where do you think? Right? That's different than saying, how do you feel about this? Right? How do you feel about this is totally open. And this is, I would say, not a fully closed question. Do you feel good about it? Is a very closed question. Right? And in fact, it's putting your thumb on the scale. And I think that's one of the most important things we have to realize is that we have control over how open and closed we make our questions. When we're doing user research, and I learned this very early on in my career as a designer, innovation person, when you ask people questions as a user researcher, you have to ask them questions that are open-ended. As Bartosz says, you want to get more information on the table. You want to get more threads to explore. But sometimes you have to narrow the conversation down. And I want us to start seeing open and closed, not as a switch, but as like one of those old-fashioned Frankenstein, dials that we go from fully on to a little bit to fully off. 1 to 10 is putting guardrails on it. It is closed because it's actually asking someone to give you a number, but it's not a yes or no. Do you like this? No, not very helpful. But from 1 to 10, that really does narrow down the conversation, as Deborah saying. Closed-ended questions give some more control. I'm curious if anybody who flipped a closed question to open found a question here that they think is interesting and worth exploring. If there's a question that when they flipped it from closed to open, they found more energy or perspective. And yes, exactly. It is very helpful if you want to pin people down when they're being evasive. Do you want this project to happen is a very, very closed question. It's very, very on the nose. And sometimes you have to ask, that's a very powerful question. And it is a closed question. Right, Patrick, you're 100% right. So is anybody willing to share their experience of taking a closed question and turning it into an open-ended question and finding something interesting there? Similarly, if anybody turned an open question into a closed question and found something interesting there. What was surprising? Go for it, Alexander.
So I changed an open question into a closed question. So instead of how are you feeling okay? I don't think that's a very good idea.
Yes.
I'd rather keep it an open question.
Yes.
Because by this, I am implying that you are okay. Or that person might not be very comfortable with saying, not really. I'm not really okay.
Yes, this is like when a waiter comes over and says, everything good here? You're like, no, yes. No, everything isn't good here. How is everything is more open and more generous. And also, Bartosz, I think it's really what you're saying is this is a question of power, right? And power is one of the elements of the conversation operating system. And I think being sensitive to power, a closed question does take more power. It is a power-taking stance to say, are you feeling okay? Well, you're implying that I should feel okay. But if you look at some of the questions here that I think are very powerful, for example, do you think this is doable? Or do you want to do this? These are two very, very powerful questions. Three very powerful. Do you think this is doable? Do you want to do this? And could there be other approaches? Are three very, very powerful questions that take power. They all have yes or no answers, but in fact, they invite more deeper introspection. Do you think this is doable? Do you want to do this? Are there other ways to do this? No, yes. But in fact, they are more open-ended questions than we realize. They're not simple yes or no questions. They invoke much deeper conversation. Yeah, and Patrick, this is true. I mean, Patrick's point is about, are you doing okay? Is it okay to say that I'm not okay? Do you really want to know? It can show that I would like you to feel okay, right? I'm anchoring to, are you feeling okay? How are you doing is more open, but are you doing okay? It could be, as Deborah pointed out, putting our thumb on the scale, or it could be anchoring to the fact that we do want people. Yeah, Patrick, you can go ahead. Thank you for raising your hand. You're very thoughtful.
Oh, sure. Yeah, just that if I'm observing someone and they don't seem to have the energy level, or they're making expressions that indicate some form of illness, and I'm curious and or I'm concerned about them. So I think it all depends on the relationship that I would have with that person and whether they feel safe in answering. I think you kind of touched on that. So I think it depends on the context, certainly, like virtually everything else.
Yes. My point, that I sort of would want to close on for these two exercises is, for sure, we had a lot more open-ended questions than closed questions. But the idea that closed questions can't be powerful, it is taking power in that moment, as Bartosz said. I think it's important, and this is one of these questions. There's the classic Chris Voss question, which is, have you given up on this initiative? And this is one of these classic closed questions that can spark someone to action, because no one wants to say, yes, I've given up on this initiative. And so if you ever have a client or a senior person and you can't seem to get them to engage with you, and it's been days and weeks since you've gotten a response, sending that message of, have you given up on this initiative, is a closed question that actually sparks people to activity, because the answer no is unacceptable to them. And so what I want you to do in terms of your own ability to ask powerful questions is to break out of the polarity of open versus closed and realize that there is value at both ends of the spectrum, and we have control in the middle with how open and how closed we make our questions. And having control over that means that we have control over the responses that we invoke in other people. And as Patrick said, yeah, they're not bad. But I think very often they have this mindset. We have this mindset. We're often taught open, good, closed, bad. And it's clearly not the case. I thought I would try an experiment. Often I think about mapping powerful questions along the time spectrum of when we find these questions are most valuable and impactful in our process. But of course, since we're talking about Agile, it's not a linear process. So I love that somebody's just putting it right in the beginning, right in the middle. So I'm wondering if we can take like 2 or 3 minutes and see if we can't copy and paste some of these questions along the Agile journey map, from defining challenges to building the right things right, as opposed to the wrong things wrong or the wrong things right, and releasing them into the world. What questions of all of the ones that we've been capturing, and maybe there's some new ones that this diagram helps inspire for you. Review all of the questions above, copy a question and paste it. Let's not destroy the work that we've done in the question flipping. Copy and paste it where you think it can have the most impact on a project. And then if you feel like it can have impact across the spectrum, I would say, you can just put it up, over, and above. But if you feel like it has specific benefit to one area, or if it has universal, like either put it in a place, or I would put it, if you think it has just, generalizable impact, I'll make a darker area here. Which questions have the most power when? Yeah, and Patrick, I love that your question of like, what is the ideal state? And then how do we know? How will we know we've gotten there? Those are definitely questions that exist across the beginning, the middle, and the end of the process, right? Once we get to the end, how do we know? Not just what does success look like, but have we gotten there? What can we measure? I'm going to zoom in a little bit to see what we can see here. I've started getting reading glasses, so this is tough for me. How can I support you? Do you have an ultimate goal? Why do you care? Could we do this better? Do you want A or B to happen? What does success look like to you? What is the opportunity here? I'd love to unpack this a little bit. Let's take a look at the defined questions, the questions that we feel have the most impact at the upfront of the process. Do you want this to happen? Could there be other approaches? What is our purpose? Are there other questions that we feel are missing that we use to invoke and design a powerful beginning to a cycle? What does success look like to you? Why is this important to you? Do you want A or B to happen? These are definitely ones that are about what are we trying to accomplish? These are definitely questions that are about setting the intention. And then there's others where it's like, okay, again, what is our goal? Why do we care? I see a lot of overlap in these questions that are very open-ended, that are about setting the intention and identifying blockers, which is very, very interesting to me. What is your expectations? Is this the right thing to do right now? I feel like you need to add another right in there. Get that alliterative capacity in the question. I love that somebody put, have you given up on this initiative? We all know that there's a dip in the build process. Who put this question here, or who wrote this question? I love that this has gotten like 3 fires and is put here sort of at the on the downward arc of the build loop. I want to highlight 2 questions that I think are very, very interesting and maybe in tension with each other, because we've got what's missing in your product. And then there's this other question here, which I think is very powerful, which is what is the worst that can happen and can you handle that? And it makes perfect sense that these have been put where they are in the build process, which is, do you think this is doable? What's the worst that can happen? And what is missing that could make a difference? I think it's very, very interesting to see this arc. Oh, Alexandra, I'm sorry if you're having trouble getting in. If you drop them in the chat again, we can get everyone to be your hands. Accessibility is a thing.
That would be great, thanks. I'm on mobile, that's probably why.
Totally. Can someone pretty please grab Alexander's, have we considered the feasibility risks? Have we considered what might go wrong, right? Which is like kind of the opposite of what's the worst that can happen. And if somebody can grab the feasibility risks.
Yeah, it's kind of like thinking, often you think, what is the happy path? But more often than not, we forget to think, what's the unhappy path?
Totally. And now here's the thing. It's like, I think there's this idea of like positivity versus negativity. I think having the capacity to ask questions on both sides of that spectrum, we're going to talk a little bit more about that orientation in the 2 exercises down. I'm curious if anybody has a question that they want to make sure they add to their arc. I want you to start thinking about powerful questions as an arc that you are building, that the questions at the beginning of the build towards the downward curve of build into release, that we are bending the conversation along this path through the questions that we ask. We bend the conversation along a path using these questions. And I definitely am excited about some of the questions that I'm seeing here. If anybody wants to drop a question that they are surprised or excited by into the chat, I would very, very, very much like to hear about that. And thanks for joining. And we have SG joining in your place. Okay, so anybody want to share any insights from this journey mapping exercise that we've done before we move to the next exercise that we're going to attempt?
I'm kind of surprised that we have so many questions in the define space. In comparison, so few in the build.
Yeah, tell me more about that, Bartos.
So maybe you are not asking enough questions when we are committed to building something. I don't know. But I like your metaphor about the arc. So even though we're mapping the questions in define, build, and release areas, I like the metaphor that our conversations also have this arc. So we kind of define what we are having conversation about, and then having it actually exploring, and then finishing it in a way.
Yeah. Thank you for clarifying that, because I think, and maybe this is because I have a product design background, but I think about conversations in a product mindset. Because indeed, as you say, we come together, we define what we're going to talk about, we build a set of meaning together, and then hopefully at the end of this, we release something from our conversation. We act or transact. And there's some links in my book where Google does have a conversation design framework that it adapted from cybernetic theory and conversation theory. That is just this, that we can model the conversational process. It matches this arc very clearly. Define, build, and release. Connect, open, explore, build, close, release. And it's not surprising to me that some of the close-ended questions are on the release side and that some of the open questions are on the define side, because in the define end, we need to be more open. And towards the release, if we're trying to bend the conversation and move things forward, we're going to ask some more close-ended questions. Like, can you commit to doing this? Do you think this was successful? Yes or no? Did we meet our goals? So it is definitely a thing that open versus closed questions, we have control over them. And when we ask them in the process can shape the arc of the conversation differently. So I haven't tried this exercise before, so I'm very, very curious to see how this works out. Questions have an orientation. Questions can refer to the present, they can refer to the past, or they can push us towards the future. And so what I would love for you to do is take a look through the questions here and copy and paste any questions that you think have a past orientation versus questions that have a future orientation. I see somebody's put can you commit to doing this, which is a sort of like present to future orientation, right? It's moving the conversation from the present into the future versus a question that has a pure past orientation, how we can have learned from the past. Like, can we learn what happened is a sort of a past oriented question. What went well? What went wrong? How is it different from what we tried so far? It's such an interesting question. It's somewhere between the past and the present. It's like, well, how is this different than what we've done in the past? And this is a classic question, by the way. I don't know if anybody's ever been in one of these sessions where someone said, well, we tried that a few years ago, so that idea won't work. This is a very powerful question. Well, how is it different now than what we tried in the past? Or how is now different from the past? Yeah, I feel like a question like, how do you feel about this is a very, very present tense question. Whereas I would actually say, could we do it better is a more future-oriented question. How can we learn from the past? This is a very interesting head twist, I have to say. Is how can we learn from the past a future-oriented question? I would say how can we learn from the past is a present tense question that is oriented to the future through the past, if that makes sense to you all. I'm also curious if anybody sees any of the questions that are past, present, or future-oriented and that they feel could be made more powerful by shifting its time orientation.
I don't know exactly, but what will be the outcome for me is a future tense, but is more for the present time, because the outcome will happen in the future, but we want to know it at the moment.
Yes. What will be the outcome? It is a question that has a direction, right? And this is what I want you to start seeing, is that questions have an orientation or a direction. What will be the outcome is asked from the present to the future, right? Now, when I am in a coaching conversation, often I'll ask a question of somebody to say, hey, let's think about 3 years from now. It's been the best 3 years of your life. What are you excited about? I hope this doesn't bend your brains too much. I ask people to speak from the present to me now. So it's actually a present tense question from the future to the present. I ask somebody to say, I have accomplished, not in the last 3 years, I will have, in the next 3 years, I will have, but to say, I have accomplished blank. And this is a flipped orientation. It's speaking from the future to the present in the present tense. Now, this is a little weird, but it's a very, very powerful mode. I really, really try to push people not to say, oh man, I really want to do X, Y, and Z over the next 3 years, but to say from their future self, oh my God, I've accomplished all of these things. It's a very, very different stance to speak not from the present to the future, I will have accomplished these things, but to speak from the future to the present, I have accomplished all these things. And so I want you to be aware of the power we have to flip the time orientation of our questions. Learning from the past is very powerful. Speaking to the present directly, how do you feel about this, is really, really important. One of the things that my coach likes to say is that any feeling fully felt transforms into something else. A lot of people will do something to folks where they say, oh my God, I'm so depressed, or, I've had a death in the family. And they say, well, they're in a better place, or you'll get better. We try to push them towards the future. Things will get better. We do what's called bright siding. Speaking directly to the present, how do you feel about this? What's it like? I'm sorry for your loss is different than saying they're in a better place. Present tense versus future tense is very, very powerful. And yeah, 100%, I am a big fan of Viktor Frankl's work and logotherapy. If you haven't read Man's Search for Meaning, I highly recommend it. So having the ability to shift the time orientation of your questions is very powerful. And some of these questions have it baked in here. How is now different from the past, right? Do you think this is doable? But a pre-mortem, has anybody ever done a pre-mortem? A pre-mortem, and I don't know if there's a question that's like this, where we ask ourselves, how did we screw it up? It's asking the question, how did we screw it up? We're starting this project and we want to ask the future from the present, in what ways might we have screwed up this project? And then let's also ask the question, in what ways did we do it brilliantly? And how can we make sure we do this? And this speaks to the next sorting of questions that I want us to do. I'm going to invite you all to join me here in the conversation matrix. And so I want to introduce us to the last framework we're going to play with. I'm going to try and leave some time for Q&A after this. But I'd love for us to bring all of the questions that we've oriented so far. We can just copy and paste them into this matrix. It's very important to think about the problem versus the solution orientation of a question. And that question of how did we screw it up, or how did we do this beautifully? In what ways were we successful is one way to think about problem versus solution orientation. I would actually call that maybe more negative versus positive orientation. Are we focused on defining the problem and understanding the problem? Or are we focused on generating and building solutions? And the other axis of this matrix is asking versus telling. An ask is a pure ask. It's an open-ended question. A tell is giving people a more forward-looking instruction. And I might call the ask problem quadrant, I would certainly call this the whole upper part, the gentle upper half. This quadrant, going from quadrant on the lower left to the lower right, where you tell somebody the problem and tell them the solution, we might call a consultant's path. Asking people about their solutions is much more in the coaching mindset. Sometimes telling people about their problems is about, if you've ever read Radical Candor, and if you've ever read a book called Humble Inquiry, that's what I would call that upper left-hand corner. So let's bring in some of those questions that we've oriented to so far. I'm going to put a few minutes on the clock. I'd love to see all of the questions we've asked so far oriented to this ask versus tell and problem versus solution. Ooh, I love that somebody added mentorship. For sure, sometimes telling somebody the solution is a very generous thing to do as a mentor. Yeah, and for sure, Faith, as you said, Triz, this question of looking for how we might have screwed it up and looking back, is that process is definitely baked into Triz. And if people aren't familiar with Triz, you can Google it. Well, you might get the weirder version of Triz, which is the Russian innovation framework.
But how did we screw it up? We could ask this question when we face the problem sometimes. Then we ask ourselves, how did we screw it up that we have now the problem?
Yes.
It means that we had already a solution, then this solution didn't work. Then we have now the new problem kind of thing. Then we ask ourselves, how did we screw it up that we have this new problem? Can it be or not really?
I think it's a great question. And I think it's totally fine if you put it there in the ask versus problem quadrant. I think it is. How did we screw it up? Is definitely not saying you screwed it up. It's not telling somebody that they've screwed it up. It's asking, how did we screw it up? And this matrix doesn't include the time axis in it. So I think it is a totally legitimate problem-oriented question to ask. I think it's a great question. I don't think any one of these ways of sorting questions tells the whole story by any stretch of the imagination. I definitely think there's more questions to bring in from the earlier sorting, and I would love everybody's help bringing in more of these questions. Not surprisingly, one of the first times I used this matrix in a leadership development program that I was running, one of the things that came up that was very interesting was asking people which quadrant they wanted to grow into most. And I'd be very curious if people want to drop in the chat after having looked at this matrix and looking at some of these questions, which quadrant they think they are most comfortable in and which quadrant they feel like they want to grow the most in. I would love for everyone to check, all 84 of you, to check in and say, here's the quadrant that I think I am strong in, and here's the quadrant that I feel like I need to grow into. So for those of you that have identified the quadrants that you need to grow into, I think it's worth asking, what kinds of questions do I need to get more comfortable asking in order to be able to lean into that quadrant? I used to, when I first started using this diagram, and when I wrote about it in my book, I definitely am a huge fan of humble inquiry. But when I ran this workshop for this leadership development program, I was surprised at how many people said they wanted to get better at simply telling people what solutions they felt needed to exist, to really own their expertise, to speak their truth. And I think that's really powerful. This is not like Radical Candor's 2x2, which says there's a good quadrant and a bad quadrant. There is nothing wrong with one quadrant versus another. It's more about which quadrant is most relevant to you. Which quadrant will get you what you need out of the people you're working with, and how do you want to grow? Now, I would also posit that modern leadership is not just dictating, telling people the problem and telling them the solution. Being a coaching leader, being what I would call a conversation designer or a conversational leader, is very, very intentionally moving across the path, going from asking to telling gently, going from investigating the problem to exploring solutions with people leading first. And when they are not seeing what needs to be seen, finding ways to point towards getting them where they need to go. It's doing what we need to do to get people where they need to go through the questions that we ask. We only have a little bit more time left. I'm very curious if anybody would like to share with me any of the questions, a new question that you might be leaving with. I've summoned you all here. This is the place we're going to be. I'm going to release you all now. But I would love for you to capture at least one or two questions that is new for you that will help you occupy the quadrants that you want to occupy, right? You can zoom way out, go back to the beginning of the powerful questions to some of the ones that are open and closed. Think about questions that are in a different part of the journey than you would normally focus on. Where do you feel like you need more questions in your journey? Think about the time orientation of your question. How can you drive thinking to be reflective and retrospective, or pre-retroflexive, learning about the past from the future, speaking from the future to the present instead of just asking the future from the present? These are all very powerful ways to invoke deeper conversation. And then finally, which quadrant of the conversation matrix do you feel like you need to grow into? Let's capture some of those questions. Yeah, asking in the present, how did we screw it up? A TRIZ-oriented question. What am I not asking you that you really want me to ask is one of my favorite questions. What haven't I asked you that I should ask you is a great question. What are you excited about having accomplished? Is a really powerful question. And then, Alex, I know this was one of the questions you came in with. When is it good enough? Very powerful question. And I love that several people have captured one of my favorite questions. Have you given up on this? Which is a really, really powerful question. It inspires people to say, no. We still want to make this happen. So we only have a few more minutes. Thank you so much, all of you, for sticking around till these new powerful questions. If there's one more that's on the tip of your tongue, I am going to reveal there's one last area that I'm opening up, and that is a links section at the bottom, which you should be able to find now. There's a few links there, a couple of podcasts that are particularly relevant to this topic, from my friend Oscar Trimboli, who wrote a book on deep listening. One of his favorite questions, especially to deal with somebody who you disagree with strongly, is to ask them, when was the first time you formed that opinion? This is a question that orients from the present to the past and gets us stories about why they think what they think? It's a very, very powerful question. And a future-oriented question that I learned from Nancy McGaw, who is the deputy director of the Aspen Institute for Business and Society, an absolute blockbuster leader. If somebody is very, very much against an initiative, one of her favorite questions is, what would have to be true? What would have to be true? Very, very powerful question to get people to think differently, pushing to the past to get stories and pushing to the future to get a blocker to become a problem solver on your behalf. And the New Yorker article, The Underrated Pleasures of Eating Dinner Early, starts off with this meditation on the power of that as a strange, surprising icebreaker. I will pause for a moment. It seems like there's, you can totally get a copy of the Mural Board. You have it right now. I will also export it as a PDF, and I'm totally happy to share that with everybody through you, Stefan, 100%. Oh yeah, that's a great idea. Alexander, everyone else should do what Alex is doing, is let's check in with the word. Hussein, do you feel curious? Mari, do you still feel interested? I'm wondering if Judy feels like she's been able to challenge others with what she's learned today. Bartosz, are you inspired? Let's have a one-word check out in the chat. I'd love to hear what you're checking out with from today. I'm glad the session was delicious for you, Fateh. I appreciate that. Miriam, are you inspired? Did we deliver on your expectation of inspiration? I got a thumbs up. With our last couple of minutes, thank you everyone for showing up. Of course, I am an executive coach and consultant. I have tried to help teams and leaders transform their organizations through better conversation. I think conversations are the fundamental unit of change. And if there's any way I can help, please feel to reach out. That's what we do. Stefan, thanks for this opportunity to connect with all these awesome people. I will hereby put my pen down.
You're very much welcome. Thank you for hosting this great session, I would rather say. So it was totally awesome. By the way, you will find more links to how to connect with Daniel in the meetup page. There's a section with Get to Know Daniel better, so LinkedIn, and please check out the podcast if you do not know the Conversation Factory. That is totally awesome, and it's one of my favorite podcasts. We have about 40 to 60 minutes, depends a bit on the topic, but it's totally awesome. It's a very, very good treat for everyone here.
Thank you so much, man. I really appreciate the opportunity. And thank you for whoever put the Spotify link in there. That's awesome. I love that that is a thing that exists, that it sort of automatically gets on there. I'm adding that to my own links.
This was my first hands-on Agile meetup session I joined. I just want to say this is really great, really inspiring and informative.
That is awesome. Thank you for saying so.
And if no one else has questions, I'm curious to hear, Daniel, and in general, if anyone else has any good answers, what your thoughts are about my question. I think trust is a key part of being able to ask and get answers to good questions.
Yeah, I remember a little bit about your question. It's way up there. This is the question of like, how do we build more of this way of thinking?
How do you build up the prerequisite of trust in an organization to be able to get good and honest answers, but answers which are honest in the way that people can feel vulnerable enough to answer them without, the cage coming down and being spotlighted for being wrong or having bad ideas?
It's a really, really great question. And I think it comes down to psychological safety. Esther Derby, who's an amazing Agile coach who wrote a book called 7 Rules for Positive, Productive Change. I had her on my show some time ago, and she has a wonderful exercise that she talks about in that conversation where she actually facilitates a conversation about what do we do when we feel safe and what do we do when we feel unsafe, and just tries to get us to get a team to at least orient to the understanding that when we feel unsafe, we act differently and we don't bring our best. The question of how we can cultivate psychological safety in a team is a leadership question, right? But it starts from being aware that sometimes people feel unsafe, and when they don't give their best. And I think that simple realization gets people to wake up and go, wait a minute, how do I make sure that everyone feels safe? I think that just that question gets us a tremendous amount of safety. And if you haven't, I also recommend Sand Talk by Tyson Yunkaporta. It's about indigenous thinking. And his perspective is we can't actually create safety. We can only design protocols of protection that everyone is engaged with. It is the leadership's team job. It is the team's job to ask, how might we create the conditions? And it's different for everyone because every company, every team's culture is unique. And we have to just design those protocols of protection of how might we make sure that everyone feels like they can be seen and heard. Because some people we like to think out loud, and some people like to think in our heads and need a little bit more time to do that. And so we can design sessions that will allow introverts and extroverts to both coexist. But I think it comes from having the conversation. Yes, unless leaders don't want you to feel safe. And I hope that those leaders just age out of their jobs / compost eventually, that these ways of being just, yes, there's still some people who believe that when you keep people on their toes, they do better work. I hope that in the organizations that we all touch and feel, we can try to inspire a more evolved form of leadership that respects that people's capacities and capabilities. And I think that's true.
Absolutely.
As Fateh is saying, ask foolish questions. Like going first, modeling is another way to do it, right? So having the conversation about safety is one way to do it. Modeling the experience of asking a dumb question and going first is another way to do it.
If no one else has any other questions, I just want to say thank you, Daniel, for taking the time to answer that question. I'll definitely check out Esther's interview.
Yeah, she's a powerhouse and a badass. And I learned a lot from her. Highly recommend. I have a book club as part of my podcast, and we just did a book club recently on Tyson's book. I also interviewed him on the podcast. Highly recommend his book if you want to bring in more complexity thinking into your work.
That's amazing. Always good recommendations. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And yeah, like I said, I've had some good experiences, good successes with doing blameless postmortems as a really nice trust building exercise with some good ground rules. Does Hanlo's razor ring any bells?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
The idea that instead of, never attribute malice what you can to stupidity, it's more about attributing malice to what you can to, someone having a bad day, someone's mother having cancer, or, there could be 1,000 reasons why someone does anything.
Yes. There's a famous quote, maybe it's Thoreau, that says that everyone is fighting a mighty battle. And so being kind is a legitimate path to take, because we just don't know what anybody else is dealing with on the other side.
Empathy wins today.
Yeah. I think it's time to shut down shop.
Yes.
I really appreciate the time, and I appreciate the extra questions and everyone who hung out.
Yeah, totally. It's a great community. It's really fun to organize things and see it grow. I mean, it's really rewarding, and wouldn't be possible without the Daniel Stillmans of this world. So again, thank you very much for putting in your time here and all the effort, and it's highly appreciated.
Thank you for letting me prototype with your community. This was fun.
If you like to continue prototyping, let me know.
Okay, will do. Thank you, brother.
So everyone's still here. Thanks a lot for being here, and have a great day. Bye.